Hey, welcome to episode 29 of the ASKJV Podcast. Today I'm talking about how to schedule your recording and mixing sessions, triggering ghost notes for snares, more about gain staging, and also getting into string gauges and what to use for tracking guitar.
3, 2, 1. This is the ASKJV Show.
Our first question comes from Bevan. How do you plan out your schedule for recording sessions from the start of pre-production to the final mix to make sure you get a record done within a reasonable amount of time?
Hey, Bevan. It depends on what your workflow is and the usual amount of time that it takes you to do a project. I just found for me, to be honest, I can't remember when I settled on this amount of time, but I just always booked 2 days per song to track. And then, depending on how many songs we were doing, I knew I could mix 1 to 2 songs per day after that on my own. So I guess in general, the guideline would be I was booking out in my calendar about 3 days per song. So if we were doing a 5-song EP, I'd have about 15 days of time in total. And 10 of those would be in the studio for recording, and then 5 afterwards, maybe 4 instead for mixing. So again, I can't remember exactly when I settled on this, but I guess just over the years, I just realized that I could, knock out recording a song in 2 days, and that was pretty consistent. So I just went with that, and I started booking that. And on my all of my correspondence with artists, I would say, we're going to be in the studio from this date to this date, and it was always very clear that that was the time that was allotted for recording, and that I was going to mix certain dates after that and have a deadline for the mix as well. So hopefully that helps. Just try to look back at all the projects you've done and see how long they've taken you, and be real with yourself about if you're wasting time, if you could speed that up just by putting constraints on it a little bit. That tends to be the case. If you leave things open-ended, it's always going to expand to fill more time. So the more you can place limits on the amount of time you're going to spend on something, the more likely you are to actually complete it in that time.
Our next question comes from Adam. Hey man, after getting used to using Trigger 2 in your samples, I've started to wonder something. How do you go about replacing/enhancing ghost notes and cross sticks and whatnot with samples?
So for cross sticks, I do have some samples I made years and years ago that I use. I don't have them available online anywhere, but you can just make your own. They're just simple recordings I made of a drummer doing a cross stick during a recording session, and got a few different positions, so a few different sounds in terms of like the pitch of it. And that pretty much covers all my bases if I need that. If you don't have that, make your own, or just use like a MIDI instrument. Sometimes in a pinch that can work. Just pull up like Expand in Pro Tools or whatever, in any DAW, whatever is the stock, drum machine or MIDI instrument, and just find a cross stick sample there and just EQ it to fit in your mix. So pretty simple stuff there. In terms of triggering ghost notes, my preference is to not do it. So my go-to approach would be to trigger all of the hard hits with samples, and then use the live snare track to fill in all the ghost notes and quieter hits. So basically I'll use volume automation for the most part, but also if needed I'll use automation on a gate plugin. So if I'm using a lot of the live snare track in the mix, I'll actually automate the gate to let through the ghost notes in the parts where it needs to be there, and then put the gate back to be cutting out the bleed where there are no ghost notes. And then just from there using volume automation to bring up the live snare tracks during those ghost note parts. That's really my main approach. The other thing I'll do, if it's recorded well and the ghost notes are very clear and the transients are clear, I'll first go through and I'll trigger all of the hard hits and print that down to a new track, and then I will adjust the trigger settings then to pick up some of the more sensitive hits, and then I'll just punch in on the sample track with the ghost notes on there if it's triggering well. I try to avoid trying to trigger ghost notes in great detail because it's just such a time suck. It's very time consuming. Trigger, the plugin works awesome on hard hits and pretty much most drum hits, but when it comes to the really quiet, detailed ghost notes, I find it can be more inaccurate, and you end up going through and zooming in and lining up all the hits by hand and trying to fix it all that way. And that's just very frustrating, very time consuming. So I'll always try to use the live snare. Another tip too is if you are like replacing the snare sound completely or close to it, still try to use the live snare track for the fills and ghost notes, but just EQ it to try to match the sample snare. So if your sample snare is, way deeper sounding, it has a lot more low end, for example, than the live snare track, just add a ton of low end to the live snare track and try to get it in the same ballpark as the hits that you're using for the hard hits on the sample. So hopefully that helps. I try to use the live snare as much as I can in those cases, only resorting to triggering after the fact.
This question comes from Axel. To be honest, I wish to know everything involved in gain staging, all the ins and outs thereof, because if we do the recommendation and bring all the levels on the faders to negative 18 dB, our mixes will not be competitive volume-wise. So how do we get the volume? Since they tell us that negative 18 dB is equivalent to 0 VU on analog. But that leaves us with very low loudness for our finished track. Do we use the limiter on the stereo bus to compensate for this, or what do we do?
All right, so this is kind of a complicated issue. Lots of people saying different things. And in my opinion, emphasizing this kind of gain staging in the box idea way too much and kind of leading people off track. I know some of you out there have commented and disagree with me on that, but I just think, it's not as important as people make it out to be in terms of, set all of your audio tracks to be minus 18 dB, for example, in the box. It's really not necessary. I've never done it, and I've done fine. So my approach is basically, I'm don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to push everything as close to 0 as possible on all my tracks, not at all. But I'm trying to keep it, in the green range where it's just turning to yellow, in the Pro Tools meters. That's where I try to look at it. I'm not trying to push it. I don't want things peaking, but I'm also not worrying about checking, if it's minus 18 and if it's above that, then I bring it down. I bring it down to a reasonable level. I'm not checking numbers. I'm not analyzing it mathematically. I'm just using the meters visually, and then if I'm trying to use some plugins and it's clipping easily on the outputs, then I'll just bring the audio track down a little bit. It's just simple like that. Just and the thing is, this has a lot to do with your converter calibration and stuff like that. In the box when you're mixing, you have a lot of headroom, even above where the clip light comes on. So don't worry too much about it. Now, if your levels are low, then, like you said, on the master fader, you just use a limiter or something like that to just bring the overall level up. Or, honestly, if you're mixing and you've got, your final output is only going halfway up the meters and you need it to be loud, just literally take the master fader and turn it up. So that's one way to do it easily. And then, of course, if you want to, limit on the output or put some mastering processing on there, you put that on your master fader and bring up the level that way. That's totally fine to do. Don't overthink it. That's kind of my take on it. Again, I'm sure I will get some comments of people who feel otherwise, but I guess to stick strictly to your question, if your levels are too low on your final output, just use the master fader, turn it up, or use a plugin to just turn up the final output on there.
Our last question comes from Eric. When tracking guitars, how do you determine what string gauge is needed for which tuning? I also know that scale length comes into play. Can you elaborate on that as well?
All right, so over my years recording a bunch of heavy albums, I definitely became a little bit of a stickler in terms of string gauge, because I just realized how much of a pain it was to get tuning right in recording, especially with the low tune stuff. So I really tried to find the right string gauges to make things easier. So here's the deal. You want to use thicker strings for lower tunings, just because it's going to have more tension on the strings, so that when they hit the note, especially a big open note, it's not going to go bow like you will get with thinner gauge strings. You want to use thicker ones that when they hit it, it's just going to stay mostly solid. You can't fully get that, and a lot of it has to do with technique, but you want to get as close as you can. And thicker strings allows you to do that, allows the player to play really hard, so you get a better tone anyway, for the most part, and then not have to deal with bad tuning issues. So it's tough, though, because really most guitars, they're not made to be tuned super, super low. So, all right, I've got some strings here in my hand. I have a huge stockpile of strings left over from my studio. So first, I've got these D'Addario 56 to 11, and those are what I'd use for, drop C sharp, drop D, even standard tuning as well. You could get away with a little bit smaller strings, maybe 52s on the bottom. For when I say bottom, I mean low string, by the way. So 52s on the bottom for, you know, standard tuning, or just maybe a half step down. I wouldn't really go thinner than that because I'm trying to get guys to play hard, and again, I want the, you know, straight tone off the string. So if you're tuning lower, if you go to drop C, I would probably move up to these guys. This is a cool pack from Valeriote. It's 60 to 12, so it's extra heavy on the bottom, especially the bottom strings, 60 gauge, and then it gets thinner going up. So that's definitely helpful for drop C. You might be able to get a little bit lower with these strings too, with the 60 on the bottom. And then also what I did is I ordered a whole bunch of just individual strings that were even thicker. So this is a pack of just 68 gauge strings. So these are super thick for the low string, something that you normally only find on like a baritone, but you can get these for you know, just regular guitars. And I would use that for anything lower. So maybe like drop A tuning with bands like that, I would get them to put these big thick 68 strings on the bottom, and then maybe use like a normal heavy pack for the rest of the strings. And yeah, that super thick low string for those low tunings can really help just give you a solid tone and solid tuning, and let the player really dig in. Can be hard to get used to, of course, if they're used to playing thin strings, but it's just part of it. You gotta have the right strings to do the job. So those are some general guidelines. See what works for you, and again, just listen for the pitch and how it's going, bing, and you want strings that are going to hold solid. You know, and I've even used thicker strings like 72s. I think I have some 72s here in the room, so they're massive, but again, for those super low tunings, they can really help. So try out those strings. In terms of scale length, I'm not really going to touch that. I know, you know, different scale lengths can affect that as well. You know, the longer the neck, you're going to have more tension, right? So maybe you can get away with using slightly smaller strings if you have a longer neck, but I'm not an expert on that, so I won't talk about that. But just in terms of regular guitars, that's what I'm using. So again, recap, 56 on the bottom for, you know, kind of standard tuning to drop D. Then I drop to like a 60 on the bottom for drop C. And then below that, I'm looking for big strings like 68s, even to 72s. I will say too, sometimes in these heavier packs of strings, the G string is really thick if it's not wound, and it's really annoying and hard to play and kind of sounds weird. You can actually buy a wound G string. So I also have a pack of just single strings that are wound. I forget what the gauge is, 20 something, but it's wound on there. So if, you know, for octave chords and for any riffs on the G string, it can really make it just sounds better to me having a wound G string once you get into those thicker gauges. So check that out. I kind of got lucky. I got hooked up with a band that was sponsored from Valeriote, so I got them to order me a ton of strings, but I'm pretty sure you can just go on their website and get that stuff as well, or just, you know, talk to the band ahead of time, you know, what tuning are you, what guitars do you use, and then just say, okay, you need to go and buy such and such gauge strings before you come in. All right, that's it for this episode. Very cool questions as always. If you want to get your question answered on the show, go to AskJVPod.com. You can fill out a form there or leave a comment below. We try to scour comments and stuff and pick out some questions to put on the show. So definitely do that if you want. Hope you enjoyed last week's special episode with Joey Sturgis, by the way. I thought it'd be cool to switch it up, and I was taking some time off last week, so very grateful to him for stepping in and answering your questions. So check out last week's episode if you haven't already. Other than that, that's it. If you're not on my mailing list already, go to hardcoremusicstudio.com and put in your name and email and get my free mixing cheat sheet, and you'll also get a bunch of free content, free mixing videos, stuff like that. All of my best content is shared through the email list, and it's also where you get notified of product updates and courses opening and stuff like that. So as always, thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you on the next episode.